From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
This is live from the presidential palace in Abu Dhabi. Just listening to President Trump there for a couple of moments, who's in a bilateral meeting with the UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, who was speaking a short time ago through translation, as I mentioned, live here, and the third stop on President Trump's tour through the Middle East. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. Thank you for being with us on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kailey Leinz at my side. And Kailey, we've been talking so much about computer chips and a $1.4 trillion investment over the next 10 years. That's the hard news here. That's the headline on the terminal that President Trump is announcing, an investment from the United Arab Emirates. Much of this has to do with high-tech NVIDIA chips, right? This is, of course, the workhorse of the AI engine that has been off limits to so many countries until now. Well,
that's true. And of course, the UAE, not the only Gulf state who has been wanting to have further penetration into this kind of technology as they look to diversify their economies, has asked this of the U.S., Saudi Arabia, getting some commitments in regard to chips as well. But Bloomberg is reporting today that there are some even close to President Trump within the administration who are more hawkish on national security issues, who do have concerns about access being granted to these countries. And specifically, if some of these could actually end up in China as an end market, knowing there needs to be perhaps greater guardrails on this kind of commitment to make everybody comfortable. But obviously, that is what President Trump is in the region for, is to tout investment deals like this, as he adds the $1.4 trillion over the next 10 years. He says his commitment from the UAE to the figures yesterday from Qatar, they set up to $1.2 trillion of economic exchange. And of course, the Saudis have already pledged at least $600 billion, so they are trying to get to the $1 trillion figure as well.
Absolutely. I mentioned NVIDIA. It's good for the whole space. NVIDIA, AMD, and so many others, Amazon, Cisco, Qualcomm, all announcing investments on this trip.
It has certainly been a trip that has brought a lot of news, not just on the investments, mind you, but on the geopolitical front as well. After yesterday, of course, the president met with the new president of Syria, talk of relieving sanctions on Syria, normalizing relations, and of course, some progress being made, it seems, on a deal with Iran as well. We want to get into all of this now and turn to our colleague Annmarie Hordern, who is live in Abu Dhabi for us. Annmarie, obviously, we just heard from President Trump more about investment, but what are the other takeaways from his time spent in the UAE so far?
Well, the big headline, of course, is this $1.4 trillion, but we knew that was coming. I reported back in March that we had Sheikh Tahnoun in the Oval Office meeting with the president, talking about this investment figure the UAE could get to. But key to that was the UAE getting their hands on these advanced chips. And it seems like that is going to be one of the deliverables. To Joe and Kailey, both your points, the likes of NVIDIA, AMD, they'll win big in this. The concern, of course, has been to make sure that tech does not leak to China. So there's still a lot of discussions around how to make sure that remains secured. I had some reporting that potentially you could have AI data centers, say, in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi, but the U.S. would control who would have access to those data centers. Also interesting, coming out of this discussion between Mohammed bin Zayed, Sheikh Mohammed, the president of the UAE, as well as President Donald Trump, he said, "We look forward to seeing you at the White House." It looks like he extended an invitation for the president of the UAE to visit him in Washington, D.C.
Annmarie, big questions about Iran after the administration, in fact, put forth a written proposal for a nuclear deal. What do we expect for a response, and how long could that take?
Well, we know that they've already had about 4 meetings. This has been happening in Oman, these 4 meetings, round of talks brokered by the Omanis between Tehran and Washington. What I would say is the president, before he was in Abu Dhabi, he spoke in Doha, and he talked about another olive branch, saying that there's a report, if you read it, it was NBC News, the president mentioned it, saying that Iran is coming to the table. But if you look through what that top advisor of the Ayatollah said, he basically was outlining a deal that the president, 7 years almost to the day, May 8th, 2018, the president, Donald Trump, as the 45th president, pulled the United States out of the JCPOA. And in this report, this advisor to the Ayatollah was basically talking about the fact that we would never have a nuclear weapon, but we would still keep uranium enrichment for a civil program. Now, bipartisan, a lot of Republicans in Washington, D.C., even I think on a bipartisan basis, some Democrats would say they want to see more done when it comes to Iran. Earlier in the week, the president talked about other grievances towards Iran. Could that be part of the nuclear, a potential nuclear deal? He talked about the fact that Tehran financially backs all the proxies in this region, Lebanese Hezbollah, the Houthis, and of course Hamas.
And Annmarie, we know that is not the only deal that Trump and his administration are in active pursuit of. He, of course, still wants to see a peace deal reached between Russia and Ukraine, given that Russia only sent very low-level officials to Turkey today. Volodymyr Zelensky, of course, not meeting in person with Vladimir Putin, as he had asked of Putin to meet him there. Should we assume that President Trump at this time has no reason to extend his trip?
No, and President Trump said at this time, that's a great way to frame it, Kailey, because throughout this entire tour of the Middle East, the president kept leaving the door open to potentially peeling off and adding a stop in Istanbul if he were to meet and sit down with President Putin and even Zelensky, even though he just saw Zelensky only a few weeks ago at the Vatican, that remarkable photo. What I would say is the president today said there really is not going to be a deal until Putin and I meet, but it felt like the door was really closing. And at this point, he will not be going, it doesn't seem like, to Istanbul. It felt like there were really talks of this earlier in the week. But at this moment, that seems that door has closed. Even though the president, it seemed like he would be keen to make it happen, it doesn't seem that Moscow was ready at this moment.
Great reporting from Annmarie Hordern. It's good to have you, Annmarie. Live from Abu Dhabi with us on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We have a conversation ahead with Congressman Marlin Stutzman, the Republican, will be with us live from Capitol Hill straight ahead after we check Wall Street. Let's get our hands on the markets first. Charlie Pellet has the latest on the trade from New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much. Higher across the board. Indeed, best level of the session right now. Joe Mathieu for the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ. Like you, we are focused on news out of the Middle East, trade, tariffs, investments, earnings, and yes, a ton of economic data this morning. Right to the numbers here with the S&P now higher by 28. That is a gain of 0.5%. The Dow up 214, up 0.5. NASDAQ up 45 now, up 0.2%. But interestingly, the Bloomberg Mag 7 index trading lower now by 0.4%. The 10-year 4.44%, with the 2-year 3.96%. Spot gold up $51 the ounce, up 1.6%. And West Texas Intermediate crude 61.54 a barrel. WTI down by 2.5%. Walmart delivered another quarter of solid sales growth, but it did caution that tariffs and increasing economic turbulence means that the world's largest retailer expects to begin raising some prices this month. Walmart shares after earnings, they are down now by 0.5%. Deal news, we've got Dick's Sporting Goods reaching a $2.4 billion deal to acquire Foot Locker. Foot Locker shares, they are surging by 85% right now. Dick's Sporting Goods down by 15%. Balance of Power continues right now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York, thank you so much. Meantime, here in Washington, specifically on Capitol Hill, the work continues on trying to find a consensus around the SALT cap so that House Republicans can move forward with a floor vote next week, at least that's the goal, according to the Speaker, on budget reconciliation. This, of course, is one of the biggest outstanding issues, as some of those members of the Republican conference who come from blue states are willing to die, it seems, politically on the SALT Hill, pushing for a number higher than the $30,000, which was included in the tax bill that passed through the Ways and Means Committee yesterday. The negotiations continued this morning. The Speaker says they're going to continue through the weekend to try to find a solve here. And, of course, we know that a number of numbers have been thrown out there by members of the SALT caucus, including Congressman Nick LaLota, the Republican from New York, who was with us on the late edition of Balance of Power yesterday, on the idea of 40-80 being the sweet spot.
Maybe 40-80 will be an ultimate proposal. So far, unfortunately, the Ways and Means Committee has not offered us anything anywhere close to that. Sadly, they've been stubborn and not give us anything that we could possibly say yes to. We got to go back home and sell this. And a low 30K cap, when unlimited would come at the end of the year if this bill expires, wouldn't be sufficient for my constituents.
So again, he's got to go home to New York to sell this. And Congressman LaLota was not having too much of this idea of a cap at $30,000 for individuals, never mind the 40-80 that Kailey threw out there. It's where we start our conversation with Congressman Marlin Stutzman, the Republican representing Indiana's 3rd District, is with us live from Capitol Hill. Congressman, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. A lot of things need to happen pretty quickly here. We put the pieces together. If we follow the plan here and the timeline laid out by the Speaker, in the Budget Committee tomorrow, Rules Committee picks it up on Monday, you get a floor vote next week. Is SALT the biggest obstacle to getting this done right now?
Well, it's one of them. And Joe, it's great to be with you and Kailey again. It is. There's a lot of conversations happening today and a lot of, last-minute meetings trying to find these compromises. And I understand, that, the members from New York, New Jersey, California, those SALT districts, there's a handful of them that represent Republican districts, that this is an important issue for them. My message has been, look, I'm willing to work with you all. I understand. I don't like it because I feel like, here we have Hoosiers from Indiana that are getting they're not getting the same benefit that these liberal spending states are getting as far as the taxpayers there. But these are Republican members fighting for their districts. I understand that. But I think there should be an offset or a compromise. Let's, defund Planned Parenthood. Let's make some sort of adjustments to the Medicaid waivers. We've got to reduce our health care costs. That's the bigger item that really is blowing up the budget, and we've got to address health care costs at some point. So I understand where they're coming from, but let's work together, and I think that can happen.
Well, and we did hear suggestion from the Speaker that if they want to increase the SALT cap, you're going to have to find more spending offsets. Is it your assumption, Congressman, that only really substantially can come with even further cuts to Medicaid beyond what just went through the Energy and Commerce Committee?
Well, we'll see. And, we'll find out here. We're going to have conference here in just a couple of hours, and all of the chairmen are going to be reporting to all of the members in the House Republican Conference their work. So we'll know more. But either way, we know that we're on the wrong trajectory, and we've got to find savings sooner rather than later. I think the bigger piece that frustrates me and some other budget hawks is that we're pushing these savings out 4 years, 6 years. We need to do them right away. The DOGE team is obviously going to help with that, but we don't want to see gimmicks. We want to see action now rather than pushing it down the road. We know health care is something that has to be addressed. Now's a good time to do it. Making sure able-bodied Americans aren't taking advantage of Medicaid, and making sure that that's really there for those folks who really need it and are vulnerable.
There is an important meeting, as we discuss here, at 2:30 p.m. Washington time. The whole Republican House conference gets together behind closed doors to have this out. Congressman, we keep reading about warring factions inside the conference, a Freedom Caucus that's not getting along with the salty Republicans. Who's going to be the loudest in this meeting, and what will it generate?
Yeah, well, it's a lot like a family discussion. I have 3 siblings, and there was times when Mom and Dad called us all together and we had it out, but we walked out as a family. And I know that's what's going to happen here. Republicans we know what we have to do, making sure the Trump tax cuts are in place, over the next 5 to 10 years, making them permanent if possible. We're going to also focus on the president's agenda. No tax on tips, no tax on Social Security and his other items that he has. This is just the meeting that we have to make sure that every voice is heard. And Speaker Mike Johnson has done a good job at that, making sure that every part of our conference is being heard. And I know that's valuable to every person. At least we have the opportunity to go back home and tell our constituents, I made the case, I did everything I could. But we're not always going to get what we want. But I do think at the end, this is a bill that's really important for the American people. It, unleashes our energy production. It's going to focus on, of course, our tax policy, but reducing regulation. It is that big, beautiful bill, and that's why it's a little harder to lift it across the finish line, because there's so many facets to it. But I truly believe we're going to get it done.
Well, of course, it is the Budget Committee on which you sit that is actually going to make this one big, beautiful bill, take all of the disparate pieces that have passed through the various committees and put them back together, scheduled to happen tomorrow. Have you been given any reason to believe, Congressman, that the Budget Committee itself reassembling this could be delayed because of these outstanding issues, or is tomorrow happening no matter what?
I think tomorrow's going to happen no matter what. Any changes could be agreed upon with Speaker Johnson's office or the leadership offices, along with the budget chair and the budget committee. We would make instructions, send those to the Rules Committee. They would have to make the changes before it goes to the floor next Monday. But I feel like there's, some consensus coming together here at the end. Everybody has made their case, whether it's the SALT caucus or whether it's those of us on the Budget Committee making sure we stick to our numbers. And also, we're hearing some good things from the Senate side that they want to even take up a couple of items that may increase savings even more. At the end of the day, we want to make sure the economy is strong, the tax rates are in place. That way there's confidence in the markets, and then also that the president has what he needs to secure the border and do what he promised the American people. And so I feel like we're all unified around those big principles, and we're going to get there.
Congressman, I want to ask you, as we follow President Trump's travels across the Middle East, he's in Abu Dhabi right now in a bilateral meeting with the president of the UAE. We were struck by news earlier this week that he in fact sat down with the new leader of Syria. And it's important as we spend some time with you because you were there just a couple of weeks ago. You and Representative Corey Mills of Florida touched down in the Damascus suburb of Jobar and spent some time touring the region, meeting with officials. What did you learn? And what's going to happen next in Syria now that President Trump has sat down with its leader and removed sanctions?
Yeah, I think it's a really good opportunity for the Syrian people to see the destruction that the Syrian people had to endure under the Assad regime was just remarkable. It's even hard to comprehend without seeing it, in person and seeing the magnitude of it. Billions and billions of dollars of homes destroyed, families torn apart. And I went with a group called the Syrian American Alliance for Peace and Prosperity. And Corey and I each met with the new president separately, which was nice because we could compare our notes. You're trying to, I'm a business guy trying to figure out, how, what is he telling us that we really can trust this guy. He's got a checkered past of his own, former Al-Qaeda, former HTS. But the Syrian people have been through so much, and they're asking for the sanctions to be lifted. And of course, the president, which I was impressed by the fact he wasn't asking for military help. He wasn't asking for money from the American people. He was simply asking for the sanctions to be lifted. And the fact that he had a deal, or has a deal, offered to him by the Russians, but he didn't want to take it until he actually talked to President Trump and to America to see if, which direction they're going to go. And we know they're going to go one direction or another. But I really felt after meeting with them and being in Syria for a couple of days, they really want to be a part of the Western economy. And I think they see what's happening in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE, and the amount of prosperity and wealth that's being built there, that they want to be a part of that. He talked about trade lines, tourism in their country, commerce. So I really felt, the line that Trump used, commerce over chaos, was really applicable here.
All right, Congressman, great to have you back on Balance of Power. This Republican Congressman Marlin Stutzman of Indiana joining us live from Capitol Hill. And we'll have more on the president's trip to the Middle East in just a moment when our political panel, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, join us. That's straight ahead here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got U.S. stocks trading at the best level of the session right now. A 31-point gain in the S&P 500 index, up by about 0.5%. Dow Jones Industrial Average up now by 200. That is a gain of 0.5%. While the Nasdaq Composite Index up 56, up by about 0.3%. Stocks higher as bond yields sank after the latest economic data spurred bets that the Fed will cut rates at least twice this year to prevent a recession. The 10-year 4.43%, the 2-year 3.95%. We do have spot gold now up 1.5%. Gold at $32.25 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude oil now down 2.5%, $61.60 per barrel of WTI. President Trump says he has asked Apple's Tim Cook to stop building plants in India to make devices for the U.S., pushing the iPhone maker to add domestic production as it pivots away from China. Apple shares right now, little change, down just under 0.1%. Again, recapping here, the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all advancing. S&P up 0.5%. And balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie, we thank you as always, and we'll be back with Charlie Pellet for the latest on the Thursday trade a bit later on this hour as Charlie takes care of markets for us. We're digging into politics here in the nation's capital and abroad as President Trump continues his journey through the Middle East, touching down today in Abu Dhabi. He's inside the presidential palace right now for a bilateral meeting with the president of the UAE and a lavish dinner, not ruling out, at least as of 3 o'clock this morning, adding a stop tomorrow, Turkey, where Ukrainian peace talks are set to be held. Here's what the president said before he left Qatar.
I was thinking about going, but it's very tough because of what we're doing today and tomorrow. But, if something happened, I'd go on Friday if it was appropriate. But we have people right now negotiating, and I think that I just hope that Russia and Ukraine are able to do something, because it has to stop.
The people right now negotiating, mind you, are not principals necessarily. Vladimir Putin, of course, did not make tracks to Turkey at all, instead sending some relatively lower level aides. And while Vladimir Zelensky did head to Turkey and meet with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he also, of course, is not meeting face-to-face with these negotiators. So we want to get into this now with our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are joining us. Rick, Stonecourt Capital Partner and Republican strategist. Jeanne, Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick, when we talked about the prospect of this negotiation, if you will, happening in Turkey earlier this week, you made it clear that it was pretty obvious to you the principals were not ready to all be sitting down together at this point because so little tangible progress has actually been made to get to that point. And President Trump today said, look, obviously nothing's going to happen until I meet with Putin myself. Is that really what needs to happen here first?
It's hard to tell. I can't imagine Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin cutting a deal that's going to be acceptable to the Ukrainians. And I can't imagine a situation where all three of those principals get together to hash it out. And so typically what you would see in this kind of a scenario is, a non-principals meeting, deputies, people like that, get together, try to find common ground, build off that common ground into a deal, and then call the principals in to take credit for the deal, and try to cement the deal. Usually there's one or two issues that only a principal can make a decision on. We're not anywhere near that based on the reporting that we're getting out of Istanbul about the status of these negotiations. And I do think it's interesting that the president went from, I'm going to settle this in the first day of my presidency, to, gee, I hope they can work it out. That is a big difference in approach, and it maybe indicates a lack of confidence by this administration that something's going to get done here on the short term.
Remarkable. Jeanne, are we fooling ourselves to believe that Vladimir Putin would give the U.S. a win in mediating a peace deal with Ukraine?
I think so. First of all, I'm hoping for President Trump's sake that they have a lot of good air conditioning in that palace. It was 100 degrees in the UAE today, so God bless him. It's hot. The reality is that they're nowhere close to a deal. Donald Trump said, to Rick's point, 24 hours, 48 hours. Then he moved to a 30-day ceasefire. Zelensky agreed. Putin stalled. Then he moved to meet in Turkey. Zelensky's there. Putin is not. So this is right now all about Zelensky and Vladimir Putin trying to cozy up to Donald Trump and trying to make sure, at least for Zelensky, incredibly important that he shows Donald Trump that he is being played by Vladimir Putin, because he believes strongly that if you look at the recent history, that is what's going on. And he is hoping that Donald Trump gets so frustrated with Vladimir Putin, he pulls the lever on those sanctions they've been talking about, or if not, that he continues arming Ukraine, which we've been doing, sharing important strategic information and other ways of supporting Ukraine in the war.
Well, and to your point, Jeanne, Ukrainian President Zelensky did post on X today that Russia once again demonstrate that it does not intend to end the war, having sent a delegation of rather low-level representatives. Moreover, such a Russian approach, he says, is a sign of disrespect toward the world and all partners. And I wonder if he's intending for one partner in particular, the U.S. and President Trump, to feel disrespected here, Jeanne. We have heard, and Rick was making this point earlier, a bit of a shifting in language of President Trump, not just on the realistic timeline for him being able to broker a deal here, but also the way in which he talks about Vladimir Putin and Russia. Are you starting to see signs of the president feeling a bit disrespected?
Absolutely. And we know, just looking at this amazing trip he's gone on in the Middle East, if you want to get in good with President Trump, you need to show a lot of respect, a lot of pomp and circumstance. A good $1 trillion deal doesn't hurt. And we are getting signs that the administration and Donald Trump are feeling frustrated with Vladimir Putin. And again, he has talked openly, the administration openly, just in the last few days about sanctions on Russia. I thought the language he used today of saying there'll only be a deal if I meet with Vladimir Putin was important as well. So he is, hoping, at least from Zelensky's side, that there is some frustration there, and that at least for Europe and Ukraine, that he does indeed start to push Russia more than he has in the past.
Interesting talk of peace deals. There's been a lot of talk of deals on this trip, most of them involving money. Rick Davis, remarkable $1.4 trillion in investments the president announcing today in the UAE. He's actually with Jensen Huang right now. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, look at this. The president of the United States and the CEO of NVIDIA. Much of this deal making has to do with high-tech chips. NVIDIA and AMD specifically have been called out here. We've seen companies including Amazon, Cisco, Qualcomm also announcing new deals and partnerships on this trip. Rick, I'm guessing this will, in fact, be the lasting news from this journey. He's got his Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, with him as well. And a fascinating way to do business here, with a sharp contrast to what we saw from the previous administration.
Yeah, certainly this sort of mercantile-focused administration is going to play up the fact that wherever Donald Trump goes, investment into the U.S. follows. And look, I mean, I think it's a great positive that these countries are willing to invest in the greatest economy in the world. So I think these are positives. I would say I'm still struck by the president's comments in Saudi Arabia, where he really painted a geopolitical picture of being also a deal maker on peace in places like Syria, places like Iran, and I felt like that's a massive commitment by this administration on solving age-old problems that have existed for generations in that region. And so if he can find solutions to some of these vexing problems, like relations between Israel and Syria being normalized and the idea that we could get a nuclear deal out of Iran, that will overshadow over time the deal making that he's doing today.
Well, the president is actually speaking now after his quick chat with Jensen Huang, talking about AI development and the purchases that these Middle Eastern countries are buying things from U.S. companies. He says it's a massive project, will be bought from through the U.S., talking about how this has been a great visit and that he's leaving tomorrow, destination unknown. So maybe he is still leaving the door open to a trip to Turkey. He says he's probably going back to D.C., not definitively, I guess.
Destination unknown.
Going back to D.C. Rick, when it comes to the AI and the kind of chip equipment that we're talking about here that these countries are, I guess, going to be given access to now by the United States, Bloomberg is reporting today about how there are some China hawks, national security hawks in particular, who actually are quite hesitant about this notion, the idea that there may not be firm enough guardrails in place to ensure that the end market actually ultimately isn't China. Are those voices able to win out at all when he wants to be able to tout these deals so badly?
It's a very, very difficult issue, especially within the Republican Party, because, you know, we have a group that say no China technology going into the Middle East. We fought them on allowing Huawei in there, to get control of 5G. We've fought them on ports that they wanted to have China come in to develop. And we won those fights, but now it's up to us to determine whether we're going to give them the highest technology, not just technology, but the highest technology available to fuel what is a revolution going on in the region with building data centers, being able to power those, and being able to become more of a digital power themselves. And the question is, this cozy relationship that they've had with China, is that going to result in leakage of that technology into China? And then on the other hand, if we don't give it to them, will China then have an open door to get back into the region? This administration is not going to shut the door on the Middle East. If anything, the last week has taught us that these are relationships that they expect to span decades. And so that opens the door. But there are a lot of Republicans, as you say, hawks on China, who are not happy with the leakage of this technology in areas where they have, strong relationships with Beijing.
Wow. Jeanne, is this the new model here for presidential travel? You show up with half of Wall Street in Silicon Valley. You've got Donald Trump here with Jensen Huang in Abu Dhabi. We saw Elon Musk, Larry Fink, Sam Altman. I could keep going when he was in Saudi Arabia. Is this the new entourage?
Seems to be. I'm not sure future presidents are going to be able to do it in the way Donald Trump seems to be able to do it. He pulls this off. But I do think it is fascinating because if you look at some of the pushback, there is support, obviously, for investments in the United States and what the president has been able to achieve in that regard. But the pushback is coming from some conservatives who are likening the president's entry into the Middle East to what Barack Obama did in his first and second term, when he went over there to widespread criticism and was willing to entertain these kinds of approaches to the Middle East. Now, the world has changed an awful lot since then, but you are hearing comparisons in that regard. And of course, we can't leave out of this discussion, what do they do about Iran and the nuclear aspect of that? That is a huge question. I've been astounded by the fact the president has talked about it openly over there and seems to be saying there's a deal in the offing, but we don't know what that might look like. And Annmarie was just talking to you about that. I think that's one of the most important geopolitical issues that he needs to address right now.
Great conversation with our panel, Jeanne Zaino and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors. We thank you both. With breaking news, Kailey, on the terminal, it brings us to Coinbase. The New York Times reporting the SEC is probing whether Coinbase misstated its user numbers. The stock right now is down over 7%. It's something that we'll be following for the rest of our program here and throughout the day on Bloomberg. We'll get an update on the markets from Charlie Pellet straight ahead, right here on Bloomberg.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We are keeping an eye on shares of Coinbase right now. The stock is slumping by 6.6%. This after the New York Times reported that the SEC has been investigating whether the company misstated its user numbers in past disclosures. The Times, citing sources, says the probe began during President Biden's administration and has continued under President Trump. Again, Coinbase right now trading lower. Coinbase down by 6.5%. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, they're all advancing. Right now, the S&P is up 22, holding close to session highs, up by about 0.4%. The Dow up 162, up 0.4%, while NASDAQ is up 26, with a NASDAQ Composite Index, a gain right now of 0.1%. The 10-year at 4.44%, with a 2-year 3.96%. Spot gold up $42 the ounce to $32.19, up 1.3%. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 2.5%, $61.60 for a barrel of WTI. After earnings, Cisco System shares now higher by 5.7%. And after the close of trading today, we will be hearing from Applied Materials. Right now, Applied up by 0.9%. Recapping, S&P close to session highs, up 24, up 0.4%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. And Balance of Power continues right now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York, thank you so much. Keeping an eye on Wall Street for us here as we come to you live from Washington. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu. This is Balance of Power, where we've been spending a lot of time for the last several weeks talking about an issue that, yes, is omnipresent, it seems, here in Washington, but does have ramifications for markets like New York or other places in which people pay high taxes in some blue states. And that, of course, is the issue of the SALT cap. Just where exactly will the state and local tax deduction ultimately end up as Republicans try to find a compromise here so that they can get through their budget reconciliation package ahead of the deadline the Speaker himself has set, Memorial Day. It only leaves them a handful of legislative days, although apparently they're going beyond just the scheduled legislative days. They intend to work on a deal on SALT through the weekend, as Speaker Johnson himself told us earlier today.
I think everyone will say it was productive and that we are moving the ball forward. Everyone has known that the SALT issue is one of the big ones that we have to resolve. It's one of the key pieces of this equation to sort of meet the equilibrium point that everybody can be satisfied with. Not everybody's going to be delighted with every provision in a bill this large, but everyone can be satisfied.
That's where we start our conversation with Congressman Ryan Mackenzie, the Republican from Pennsylvania's 7th District, is with us back on Bloomberg TV and radio live from Capitol Hill. Congressman, it's great to see you. We're using all of our conversations like this just to get an update on what's happening, and I'd love to know what you're hearing specific to the argument over SALT, which seems to have ground things to a halt here before all the pieces are put together tomorrow in the Budget Committee. You're from Allentown, I believe. What do the people of Allentown or throughout the 7th District of Pennsylvania think of subsidizing high taxes in blue states?
Well, so for individuals who do face high property taxes in our local community, this is an issue that actually could be helpful to them to bring down their overall tax burden. At the same time, we want to find a compromise and land on a spot where it is not being abused by high-income earners who don't need that assistance. And so what you've been seeing in the SALT negotiations is a raising of the cap from $10,000 up beyond $30,000. That was the latest proposal, but it's still not meeting the needs and demands of folks from New York, New Jersey, California, and other places. And so I think we're going to land somewhere slightly north of that, but there will be income caps on that as well, again, so that individuals who don't really need that assistance aren't in that position to receive those benefits. But you do have to recognize that state and local taxes come in a variety of forms. Sometimes it's income taxes, but sometimes it's property taxes. And so in that instance with property taxes, it might be somebody who is a senior retiring in their home. Their value of the home has gone up significantly over the years, so they're faced with that tax burden, but they're actually not in a position to pay that on an annual basis to stay in their home because they don't have the income to sustain it. So trying to strike that appropriate balance.
Well, and of course, all of this ultimately does come down to balance. What kind of revenue can be lost and what kind of spending cuts may be able to offset that, or where else could you find revenue raisers where you're having revenue reductions? And Congressman, I ask you this knowing you have a seat on the Education and Workforce Committee in the House. One of the ways in which we are seeing a raising of revenue is a dramatic increase in the endowment tax from the current 1.4% to as high as 21%. What is that going to do to some of our higher educational institutions that, of course, not only serve as educational institutions, but research institutions as well?
So that was a change that came out of the Ways and Means Committee. That was a part of their overall tax package. But in speaking with universities, obviously some of them that would be faced with that 21% burden are very concerned about that. At the same time, we do want to see these institutions deploying their capital, not just sitting on these reserves in their endowment. We want to make sure that college is affordable for everybody across the country, and that research, if they want to do that and it can't be helped or sustained by the federal government, we want to see them deploying that capital. And so too much is being put on the sidelines for some of these universities just to simply build up their endowments for the sake of building up the endowments. And that's not what it should be about. Higher education should be about the greater good, employing people that can actually do this scientific research, making sure that American students are getting a quality education at an affordable cost. And the federal government does a lot to subsidize these institutions, not only through student loan repayment programs, but also through academic research and scientific research. Those are good things, but again, you have to have a balance that's struck, and in some instances, these universities are sitting on too much of an endowment, not deploying that capital to do the things that we would expect higher education to actually be doing.
All of this said, Congressman, will House Republicans help the Speaker meet his timeline? Budget Committee tomorrow, Rules Committee Monday, floor vote before you leave for Memorial Day.
That's a great question. I don't have an answer to it. We actually have a conference-wide meeting at 2:30 today to go over reconciliation. There are still 4 or 5 main components of this legislation that need to be ironed out. We talked about SALT, Medicaid, SNAP, the federal employees retirement program, and then a number of other smaller changes are all still on the docket. Those programs and what came out of committee are needing to have some additional work, I think, and we've been advocating for some changes as members. Leadership has been receptive, but now we're going to need to see a manager's amendment in very short order to start making some of these changes so that we can get to a place where we have broader agreement and ultimately get to 218 votes to get it passed through the House.
Well, but timing could be crucial here, Congressman, not just considering this kind of Memorial Day deadline the Speaker has set that isn't necessarily hard, but given the deadline that the Treasury Secretary has warned about an X date that could come in August when you and your colleagues are on your annual recess, he says for that reason the debt ceiling should be lifted by mid-July. Do you see risk here or need for a backup plan to separate a debt ceiling hike out of this reconciliation process in order to avert potentially what could be a catastrophic scenario?
I don't. The debt ceiling should be included in this package, and that timeline that we were given by Treasury does match, I think, even some of the less optimistic timelines for reconciliation to get done. So I think we're still on track to meet that. I don't think there should be any uncertainty about that. But at the same time, the very aggressive timeline that the Speaker set, I think that was a good thing to do. We should be pushing Congress to act. But at the same time, we always, I think, understand that that did give us some wiggle room, some breathing room, that in case things slip in negotiations past that hard deadline up front, we still have time to meet the X deadline in July or August. And so we're on track to do that. I'm optimistic that we're ultimately going to get something done when we'll keep pushing for the Memorial Day deadline, and hopefully we'll get there if those 4 or 5 big main issues that I talked about get ironed out. If not, we do have some extra time in the coming session weeks to get it done.
Only got a minute left, Congressman. I know you're obsessing over the House version because that's your job. At some point, there'll be a vote. It goes to the Senate. Are you worried about what comes back?
Well, actually, I think that should be a key part of our consideration here in the House. We've already heard some of the comments from the Senate and from the White House, and it is important to have alignment between all three of us, between the House, the Senate, and the White House, to ultimately get something done and signed into law to help the American people. So I think we should be taking that into consideration. Now, at the end of the day, it is a negotiation between those three parties. They don't get the ultimate say, so we do want to listen to what they're saying as what their red lines may be or what additions they would like to see. We should take that into consideration while we're doing our work here in the House. And, you know, again, ultimately we'll come up with a product that will actually get through this entire process.
All right, Congressman, thanks for being here on Balance of Power. Republican Congressman Ryan Mackenzie of Pennsylvania's 7th District here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much. Of course, discussing with us one aspect of President Trump's economic policy, that would be tax cuts. But there are others to consider as well, including his tariff regime that has been very on and off, hot and cold, but ultimately has led to increased concerns around the risk of a recession in the United States. This is actually something that Jamie Dimon, the CEO and chair of JP Morgan Chase, spoke about from Paris today with our colleague Francine Lacqua earlier.
I'm going to defer to economists who give it about a 50% chance. I think all these things are probably inflationary a little bit more and slowing down the economy. If there's a recession, I don't know how big it'll be or how long it'll last. Hopefully we'll avoid it, but I wouldn't take it off the table at this point.
Wouldn't take it off the table. And as we consider the fate of the U.S. economy, that is the subject of a new Bloomberg opinion piece out by Bloomberg editor-in-chief Emeritus Mathieu Winkler. You can find it on the terminal or online. It's entitled, "Is It Too Late to Salvage the U.S. Economy?" Matt, when we look at the U.S. economy, the data we got in hand today from PPI to retail sales, when we look at the incredible recovery we've seen in the equity market in the aftermath of Liberation Day on April 2nd, it's almost like it never even happened. Where do you see evidence that it indeed might be too late?
Well, you see it in an equity market, the U.S. equity market, that is underperforming the world. The last time the U.S. equity market stocks underperformed the world was 2009. And if you recall, that wasn't such a great year. It was the beginning of the end of the financial crisis, and we had a long recovery from the Great Recession. So to go from what The Economist and the Wall Street Journal separately last year before voters went to the polls said the U.S. economy is the envy of the world, to what Jamie Dimon refers to as a possibility of recession, is quite a dramatic change from where we've been.
So is this stock market whistling past the graveyard?
Well, far be it from me to say that, and hardly qualified to. But what you have seen is price fluctuations that are unprecedented. For example, these wonderful Magnificent Seven stocks, Apple in particular, in just a matter of months, lost a record amount of money in the stock market. That had never happened to Apple since it was founded in 1976. So this is the 49-year-old maker of the iPhone, and suddenly it is experiencing volatility in the market that it's never seen before. And it wasn't the only one, of course. You saw that with Meta, Alphabet, and all these other stocks. So the volatility is a, if you like, symptom of the uncertainty and the chaos that has been triggered by what you referred to earlier as the on and off tariffs. 145% initially for China, now it's back to 30-something percent. But this kind of instability that is fostered by the tariffs has created uncertainty that we didn't have at the end of last year.
Well, and of course, it's one thing to look just at stocks, but there's other asset classes to consider here as well. Looking at the bond market and what's happening in foreign exchange, which is flashing the most glaring warning signal?
Well, the bond market that you mentioned hasn't underperformed the world since 2017. And if you recall, that was the last time Trump was president. So it's been quite a while since U.S. bonds have been underperforming the rest of the world. And that, of course, is happening as we speak now. So even though there's been this recovery as if it didn't happen, it really has happened in the sense that people have gone through something that is quite traumatic, and that's got to have some kind of lasting effect. The other thing is the foreign exchange market is also reflective of this chaos that was caused by the tariffs, because you had this period of the 100 days where the U.S. dollar fell, depreciated against every major currency in the world. And of course, we haven't seen that in quite some time.
He is Bloomberg's editor-in-chief emeritus with a great piece to read on the terminal and online. Matt Winkler, we thank you so much for the insights. Matt, Kailey, he quotes the head of the Port of Los Angeles, Jeanne, who's been on the program many times with us, reminding us we could have a major reality check when it comes time for back-to-school shopping.
Yeah, well, and Walmart warning of that today,
right.
Talking about you're going to see higher prices in the month of May if you aren't seeing them already. That, of course, is just one story we're continuing to follow here on Bloomberg. We'll be back for more on what's happening both on Wall Street and in Washington in the late edition of Balance of Power at 5 p.m. Eastern. In the meantime, Bloomberg Business Week Daily is straight ahead here on Bloomberg TV and radio.